intervenciones de esta mañana, escucharemos la conferencia titulada Frente a una nueva era en la aplicación de la política de competencia a cargo de Tommaso Vallei, profesor de la Imperial College Business School. Tommaso Vallei es ingeniero mecánico por el Politécnico de Turín y cursó una maestría y doctorado en la London School of Economics and Political Science, ambos en economía. Es catedrático de Economía de Imperial College, en donde es director del Departamento de Economía y Políticas Públicas de la Escuela de Negocios. Es un gusto tenerte aquí, Tommaso. Adelante.
Buenos días a todas y todas. Me gustaría muchísimo hablar en español, pero lo temo que solo hablo italiano. Por eso usaré el idioma de los gringos, tal vez con acento británico. So thank you so much for this invitation. It's a great pleasure and honor to be here. In fact, it's my first time in Mexico, and I'm utterly enjoying it. And I have to apologize, I have never been to this country before. What did I do before? I don't know. So it's a great honor and a great opportunity. It's important also when you invite people to make disclosures, because the business we're in, competition policy, has a lot of money. And disclosure is a fundamental thing, and we are trying also to change a little bit the discourse, making sure everything is transparent. So let me disclose that I have nothing to disclose. I'm just an academic now. So I will make lots of references to my own personal, somebody's calling from France, why? Lots of references to the European Union and to the United States. So don't take it as something related to Mexico, which is a country I learned a lot yesterday, but I don't know enough about, and I should. So as it was anticipated earlier, Cani Fernandez in the first keynote, she talked about the past. Ioana Marinescu, she talked about the present, and I am supposed to talk about the future. So a new era, una nuova era, so no pressure on me. So I have to tell you what I think. So of course I cannot predict the future, but what I'll try to do, I'm gonna tell you what I think we may be doing and what I think we should be doing, okay? So it's maybe wishful thinking, but these are my views, my very personal views. So first of all, it's an exciting period. It's very exciting. Competition policy is debated a lot. There is an ongoing battle of ideas, in fact. And I'm participating to this battle of ideas because I think it's important to do that. There's lots of attributions. Some people call themselves progressives. Some are called hipsters. Some are called neo-Brandisians. Some are called more conventional conservatives. Some are called populist. So this is the debate we're in, and we should take it at face value and contribute to it. So I'll start by saying something which to this audience will sound, of course, very obvious, but it's important to remind ourselves. But then I will tell also something less obvious. So the obvious thing is that competition matters. It matters a lot. We heard it yesterday. It matters for things such as having cheaper prices. Fine. It happens to matter a lot for having more choice. It matters for having more innovation and more investments. So these are all the things we hear a lot, and it's true. It's true. So I would totally subscribe to that story. It's also broader, something that sometimes we forget, but in the current economic discussion, we talk a lot about the resilience of our economies, because obviously we were shocked during the pandemic, the war in Ukraine, how not resilient many of our economies are. And competition matters for resilience. So the opposite of resilience is dependence. If you are dependent on a few firms, if you're dependent, you create bottlenecks, and then you're not resilient at all. So competition is great for resilience, and competition is also great for democracy. If you go back in time, the founding fathers of the antitrust movement in the United States, so I'll talk about the future, but we need to also understand where we come from. So Louis Brandeis, Supreme Court judge, and others, they clearly had in mind that obviously monopolies were not good for prices, for low quantities, etc. But what the real motivation for enacting an antitrust legislation is that they thought that monopolies were not good for democracy. because monopolies, they could just buy out, they could set the rules in their own interest. So they said, we need to do this because otherwise our democracy is at stake, which is a message which is sometimes has been forgotten, I would say, in the contemporary application of competition policy. But it's important to just to say that if you enforce competition, you have a lot of pluses, To back up this with a few data, there was a book by a professor at New York University, you might have read it, Thomas Philippon. Thomas Philippon, who's a professor of finance, wrote a book called The Great Reversal. It's a book for general audiences. There is little maths, no Greek letters, and little stats. But the message is quite clear. He says that if we manage to turn our markets from oligopolistic, concentrated ones to more competitive ones, the average family, the average household in the US would see their bills reduce from 5 to 10%. Okay, that's substantial. That's big, especially during a cost of living crisis. But there is more. He also estimates there is an effect on GDP. If you have more competitive market structure, sure, you compete by setting low prices to get more customers, but also you compete by having better products. You need to invest. Without investment, you cannot succeed in a competitive economy. So there is an increase in GDP, and there is also, although it's not the main focus of competition policy, there is also a great thing that with competition, redistribution of wealth is more equal. Okay, so basically, the shareholders of firms are not uniformly distributed in the economy. They are in the pockets of a lucky few, and therefore, if there are huge rents, they contribute to increase economic inequality. Instead, if there is competition, this trickles down through higher salaries, as we heard yesterday, and so forth. So that's Thomas Philippon. I think a paper that was briefly mentioned yesterday by Ioana Marinescu, one of the co-authors is Simcha Barkai at Boston University. They find, using US data, that enforcement action increases employment. She mentioned that, and I can tell you, increases employment by 5.5%, 5.5, permanently. So it's not just a temporary phenomenon. So if you make this antitrust enforcement, this is using DOJ data, then employment increases permanently for eternity by 5.5%. Another result from that approach is that business formation goes up by 4.1%. So, which makes sense if you don't allow monopolies tend to erect barriers to entry. So it's very difficult for new entrepreneurs to enter that business. If instead you fight monopolies with vigorous enforcement, then it's easier for other firms to enter that industry. So business formation, which is an important thing for a country like Mexico. So far, so good. However, there's always a however. However, if you go out in the street and ask people, do you like competition? People would say no, right? So I'm not talking to people in this room, but to normal people, even intelligent people, they would say no. And so we need to understand why there is, probably, that's my guess. I don't like competition, so there is a disconnect, and we have to understand why there is a disconnect between the typical answer you may find in the street. We cannot ignore, and all the merits that I just told you of competition, which are true. I see at least two reasons. Two reasons. One reason is probably a misunderstanding. So competition, to the ordinary person, is associated to the past 20, 30 years of unregulated globalization. So that's what they think competition is, where there is very few winners and a lot of losers. And so there have been, dire consequences for a lot of people in our society. So maybe there is an educational message to say, this is not the competition we're talking about. Precisely, we are trying to avoid having this concentration of market power. That's why competition is good. But this is a first message that doesn't go through to the general society, which has to improve. The other reason, in my opinion, is that all these positive benefits that I told you, the Simcha Barkai paper, the Thomas Philippon, etc., they presume that there is a lot of enforcement going on. And instead, this is my personal view, we haven't enforced a lot in the past 30 years. So we need also to be honest with ourselves. If we had enforced it, we would have had these wonderful benefits. So even the case of the DOJ enforcement I told you, if you look at the number of cases that the United States have run over the past 30 years are abysmal. I mean, they are incredibly small. So Section 2 of the Sherman Act, which is abuse cases, the average, the median case per year is 0, and usually it's maybe 1 or 2, so very few. So most of the action comes from actions against cartels. And we all agree that cartels should not be there, but this is something where, as economists, we don't have much to say because you're looking for the smoking gun and that's it. Some other data, the typical enforcement in the US, again, in the 70s and 80s, the Department of Justice would challenge about 160 mergers per year. The number of challenged acquisitions would be about 160. In recent years, now there's a change, of course. In the new administration, there is a big change. But the number of challenge mergers by the DOJ would be about 50 per year, 60, so it went down. I worked and loved it for 3 years as chief economist of the European Union for competition, and again, numbers matter. No? The average number of prohibitions in mergers by DG Comp, so the antitrust enforcer in the European Union, over the past 30 years, the average is 1 merger per year has been made. So we need to reflect on these numbers. And this may be part of the answer why people don't like it. Yes, enforcement is great if you did enforce, it would be great. So this is something we need to be coming to terms with. In this period, the past 30 years, we have seen some macro phenomena that I'm sure you heard about, but it's important to remind ourselves. These macro phenomena involve a systematic increase in margins, so the ability of firms to charge above their own variable cost of production, and that's a direct measure of market power. So margins have gone up. Industrial concentration, I'm not talking about antitrust markets, but in industries, widely defined, concentration has been going up. The labor share, so how much of the GDP goes to the workers, has been going down. Turnover, so dynamism in the economy, dynamism by economists is measured by entry versus exit. Every year some firms die, like people unfortunately, and some firms are born. So a healthy measure is when more people are born compared to how many are dead. So and historically you have these figures on business formation. There is a rate of death of firms and a rate of entry. And the wedge is a good one. More firms are born compared to those who die. Until late 80s, early 90s, something changes. The rate of death is the same. So firms exit as before. So firms fail. They do. But instead, the rate of entry starts declining. To the extent that now there is less entry than there is exit. So there is a net loss. So dynamism has been going down, and some research I've been doing, maybe related to the point I made of Louis Brandeis and the threat to democracy, lobbying by big corporation is again historically on a very large increase. So these are macro, I say macro because they give you a general picture. There is no single smoking gun there. So there is now lots of people trying to dissect every single contribution, casting some doubt on the robustness of this. But the general picture is what I told you. All the elements, like in a forensic investigation, all the elements go in one and only one direction. Our economies are less competitive now than they were 30 years ago. And by the way, in all this literature, there is lots of heterogeneity. So I gave you an aggregate trend, so you have to be very careful when you look at trends. All the actions comes from the firms that matter from this audience. There is margins don't increase for small firms. Concentration don't increase when there is a lot of small firms. Instead, when there is the large successful firms, they are driving all this phenomenon of having large margins, increased concentration, lower labor share, etc. So we have to do a bit of soul searching. I think it's useful. But going forward, even if you don't want to do this exercise, which may be painful for some of us, we have to acknowledge two things. One thing is that the economics of markets has changed. So because of what I just told you, the typical firms we deal with now is very different from the typical firms we were dealing with 30 years ago. Maybe technology, maybe globalization, forget who's responsible for that. But now we are in a different space compared to 30 years ago. And also, I think, and we shouldn't ignore this, the political economy of antitrust has changed. And what I mean by that is that, and I reflect on my own personal experience, the discussion of antitrust for a long time was kept among technocrats. We are technocrats. I am a technocrat, so many of us in this room are technocrats. But citizens clearly desire more. They want more participation. They want to be heard. So I think it's a call for inclusion that we need to respond to. We need to respond to this call for inclusion. And I think there are positive signals. There are positive signals. So we heard yesterday, again from Joanna, about labor market, which is something that was unthinkable 10 years ago. Today, you're going to talk about data and privacy. And again, until 3 to 5 years ago, this would not be a matter for competition policy. It would be, at best, consumer protection. And so there are some positive signals that we are changing. Some people would say, well, if we have to respond to the needs of people, this will immediately drive into populism. It's a word we heard a lot yesterday. Maybe it's related to the Mexican situation, which is very peculiar and I'm not familiar with. But it's a general objection which is made. My reaction to that is yes, there is always, of course, the threat of the risk of populism, but try to think about it differently. Populism is often also a reaction from having kept people away from reaping the benefits of certain things, from having kept people aside from the conversation. And then it's easy to drive populism into those guys. So, and again, if we keep everything within our own technocratic antitrust bubble, we are responsible for that populism because we don't listen to other people. So, battle of ideas, I said. So these changes that which have happened to our economies in the past 30 years have happened coincidentally, perhaps. I let you judge. Also, and I go into my field, I'm an economist. So the last 30 years have also coincided with a so-called greater use of economic analysis in antitrust. So it's almost coincident one for one. We know why we started it. The motivations were great. We wanted to put some order into antitrust. We were coming from a different world, and in economics we thought could be useful, but we know how it has ended. I mean, the arrival point is where we are with these big margins. We basically challenge at most a merger to monopolies, and that's it. So the problem here lies with my own profession, lies with economists. Sorry for the economists in the audience, but we are responsible for it. Why? Because economists are trained to come up with a story for everything, with our two hands. Especially if you did a little bit of economic theory, and especially if you're a bit smart, and many economists are very smart, you can come up for a story in favor of A and for a story against A with equal ease. Which is fine in academia if it is an intellectual game that we play in the common room or over lunch. It's fine if you want to do a publication, because if you want to publish the obvious, it's not interesting. But if you publish a curious result, you may stand a chance of having a paper in a good journal. But policy is not about curiosity, no? It's not about odd results. It's about what is true on average. There is risk, there is uncertainty, but what is right on average? So, whereas having this economist approach in general is okay if it is unrelated to business interest, now, put it in the context of antitrust, where there is very asymmetric resources. We have a few large corporations which have endless resources. And again, my personal experience, I ran 3 cases against Google. You can imagine the power of a company such as Google. And on the upside, you got well-motivated enforcers, but which are always under-resourced. So you put economists there. It's about incentives. We understand incentives. All the incentives are to put even more economists, even more consultants, even more advocacy on one side only. And that creates a big doubt. You always put in doubt to what the enforcers are going to do. Academia, by the way, is largely absent in this. Okay? There are a few academic consultants, but academia, meaning what we actually research on, is on a different planet, completely disconnected. Instead, the economics I've seen in practice has been hijacked by a few very powerful economic consultancies, and these have access to the enforcers, to the big law firms, et cetera, et cetera. So this type of economics is something that we need to change. Again, talking about my own personal journey, which has affected me quite deeply, when I started the job at the European Commission, I was coming from my ivory tower, but I knew economics quite well, and then I saw the type of economics used in cases. I said, but this is not economics. This is like economics. I mean, it's a Mickey Mouse model from the Chicago school, which doesn't apply here. So I believe in competitive markets, sure, but when it comes to, I don't know, Bayer and Monsanto or Google, it's nothing to do with competitive market. These are where I expect markets not to work for lots of reasons. And instead, I see economics at work. It's very simplistic application that looks semi-scientific, but it's an application of a very narrow model of product differentiation with some numbers trying to simulate some static price effects, okay? That's what it is. And that's my immediate reaction, which I have changed, was economics can do better than that, okay? The consumer welfare as interpreted as in economics is not just the static price effects. As economists, I can define something where, as consumer, we care about investment and choice and quality. I can model all of this, and I can run cases. That was my immediate reaction, which was, let's apply economics rightly instead of being very narrow. Let's become more broad. And I immediately applied that because that is the first wave of mergers I had to do. It was in the agrochemical industry. Bayer, Monsanto, these are very large giants, Dow DuPont, and also ChemChina, Syngenta. And there, the locus of competition was on innovation, but basic R&D, not just you have a pipeline of products and you have to develop till the last mile, but you've already invented them, okay? And typically enforcers don't look at basic R&D, at fundamental research. Instead, we said we should. It's very important. We have lots of elements, and I try to say, and we can also model that nighttime. We even produce papers, which we publish, etc. And it was great, it was exciting, it was useful, but it was wrong in a sense. Why was it wrong? So the commission won, but the commission was attacked viciously. I was personally attacked incredibly hard for doing something which had never been done before. R&D, how can you predict R&D? This is crystal ball glazing. Do you know who's going to be the winner of the next football World Cup or something like this? So, silly arguments, which I could rebut. My economics is pretty solid. And, but then, it produced so many scars. It wasted so much energy that people kept asking me, the commissioner, Tommaso, are you sure? Are you sure you're very economics? We've never done before a case like this. Yes, I'm sure. Okay, I trust you. Okay. On this occasion, they trusted me. But then when I was gone, they had to run it again. I said, we wasted so much time, so much energy. Let's go back to stuff we do know how to run, that it doesn't generate all this furor, all this. And so, and this is where I also changed my mind. So I don't think that economics, and there were some allusions yesterday also, should become more sophisticated in cases. This is not academic research. Academic research can be very sophisticated, trust me. But instead, economics has to help in a more robust way to come up with something which is simple. And that's going to be helpful. So I will tell you also how you can run a case using economics. But having, going forward, bringing in more sophisticated economic analysis into our cases will create a mess. That's my prediction. Number one prediction about the future. Don't do that, otherwise it will be a big mess, because there will be a reaction to that. Don't expect that Google will sit on their toes and do nothing against it when you do a more sophisticated thing. The timing in cases, you have a few weeks to analyze a merger, okay? So all this sophisticated, and by the way, the sophisticated economic analysis is not scientific. It looks like, because there is a number, there is some Greek letters, etc., but it's not. It's a way of thinking. It's a helpful way of thinking, but that's what it is. So can economics be useful going forward? Of course, of course. Economics has brought these phenomenal contributions I told you right now, coming from the margins, the concentration, the labor share, entrepreneurship, finance, macro. They've contributed a lot. They contributed a lot to our thinking, to reset the antitrust agenda. And this kind of economics, which comes from academia, should continue and should inform our views about our job as enforcers. Economists should also help to debunk some myths. The biggest myth I have encountered in my experience as an enforcer, and I want to be clear and careful, is about efficiencies. We put in our mouth a lot this word efficiencies. And it looks like antitrust enforcement is always an impediment to this alleged efficiencies ongoing. By the way, I do believe in markets which are efficient. I believe in the fact that the more successful firms are the best ones. But when you apply antitrust to large firms, these are firms which have already exhausted economies of scale. Okay? So I believe that efficiencies reaching scale is needed for small firms, needed for medium firms, by all means. But these are not the clients of antitrust. In antitrust, you have already the largest firm in the economy. Okay? How much more large does it need to be to become even more efficient? Look at the evidence, because we tend to repeat stories and narratives. And where is the evidence? Where is the evidence that a mega merger has brought efficiencies? Ask yourself, can you come up with one? Because I'd be very happy to hear. The economics literature, which has looked into that, finds that every merger involving large firms, because we have to cut the data where it matters, not the long tail of small mergers that don't matter for your job. Among the large firms, what we find systematically is that prices went up. Surprise, surprise, okay? Systematically, this you find in 80% of the cases. And when it comes to efficiencies, nope, okay? There is not a single one. So think about, not anecdotes, but look systematic at this evidence and ask yourself, where does it come from, this narrative that all this enforcement is not allowing for efficiencies to come out? What about the economics in cases? Because I told you this bigger picture stuff is tremendously helpful, but not to run cases. In my view, economics is fundamental. Going forward, enforcers should have good economists, even more economists, because economics is great to come up with cogent theories of harm. Economics is great to think about incentives, which is instead something which is not in our disciplines, and to guide in a holistic way a forensic investigation. So you have a coherent story which has implication in terms of which data should you be looking for. So ultimately, economics is great to make sense of the data. It's great to ground the discussion on facts. And this is the type of economics that we should continue doing. But having a more complex new little model, no, I don't think this is what is needed, because once again, economic policy is different from economics research. These are two very different things. What I think should happen going forward, which is something that was alluded yesterday, but a bit quickly by Ioana Marinescu, is to bring back structural presumptions in antitrust. So Ioana mentioned more the implication for labor markets, but if you read the current draft of the DOJ FTC merger guidelines, basically they are saying concentration matters, size matters, which is something that we have lost. If you look at the Erfindel index threshold that they are using, they go back 50 years. They go back 50 years. They reverse completely a trend of having increased this threshold for screening cases completely. And think about it, again, sure, things are complicated, but sometimes economics is good to pass a sanity test. Ask yourself, in an honest way, am I more concerned of a 10-9 merger or a 3-2 merger? It's very simple. If you're honest with yourself, you would immediately say a 3-2 merger is what really matters. And that's what the structural presumptions are saying. And that's a very good starting point. Again, in a world of asymmetric resources. Because when I was an enforcer, the line to take was always, we value each case on its own basis. It's a case-by-case analysis. It's not true. You don't have the resources to analyze every single case. No? You have to fight a few battles. And you have to choose the battle you can fight. And fight those that do matter. And they matter. Larger firms matter more because they are more likely to produce great harm. It's as simple as that. So this is something that the DOJ is saying. The economists now at the FTC and the DOJ, so Susan Athey and Aviv Niver, who are the current chief economists, they don't want to scare people, so they are going out and say it's a small evolution, it's a continuation of the past. I think instead this is more a cut with the past. It's a moral revolution. These structural presumptions, which are rebuttable, a point I will return to, is something that has to be the way to do things if we want to enforce more. So, the cases that we may want to bring forward also in the next decade can be informed by economics. There's a very vibrant debate of what should be the objectives of competition authorities. It goes under the heading of the consumer welfare standard and so forth. The debate is interesting. I think in a very pragmatic way, enforcers should follow, of course, what we decide as a society we want to do with our enforcers. So there is a democratic process where we elect politicians who enact legislation, and then the enforcers have to act in that space. But in a very pragmatic way, I will also say, you can do with competition whatever is related to competition, which makes a lot of sense. I will give a couple of examples. One is on data and privacy, also anticipating the later session, and one is on the environment and sustainability. And I may say something that may be surprising to some. So the first part is probably not surprising. So data and privacy, as I mentioned earlier, it's an area where until 5 years ago, there was a response where competition authorities would say, oh, we care a lot about privacy. We care, we really do. However, it's not our job, it's for the consumer protection authorities. So, very sorry, we can't do anything, goodbye. So, and that was almost explicitly the line to take of the European Commission. But then we started looking into these digital cases. And when you do privacy applied to the digital space, well, privacy and data, the business model of this company is based on data collection. So if you don't understand data collection and the privacy, you cannot do any competitive assessment because you don't understand the business model. How on earth can you separate? Of course, it's also a matter of consumer protection. I'm not saying that. It's only a matter of competition, but it's impossible to do any competitive assessment if you don't look at data privacy as well. An example of this relationship between competition and privacy can be, for instance, found in the early days of the competition between Facebook, now they call themselves Meta, and MySpace. So the first entrant in the market for social networks was MySpace. It doesn't exist any longer now. And instead, Facebook was a new entrant. They were the challenger. Early days, they challenged. And they had a good product that consumers liked. And they also used privacy as a competitive leverage, which makes sense. These are zero price markets, okay? So consumers don't pay directly, so competition happens along other dimensions, and privacy is an obvious one. In particular, what Facebook, Zuckerberg did at the time, they made a public pledge to enforce whatever privacy users group through some discussion, excuse me, some discussions they would come up with. They would discuss Do we think it's good to share this much information? And then Facebook they pledge, they made a formal commitment. This is going to be our privacy because you decide that that's the privacy you want. Great. And it worked. And Facebook won this battle against MySpace. And then they became monopolist. And then what did they do? They reversed unilaterally the pledge. They said, from now onwards, we're not going to ask you any longer. We will implement whatever things we want, and we'll make you an offer you cannot refuse. Remember the Godfather, So, and that's what you can do if you are a monopolist. If you're a monopolist, you have nowhere to go. Either you accept or you don't use the service. And so this is just something to think that indeed privacy and competition, they go hand in hand. So, and it's good that this separation that we had for years is not tenable any longer. So that's a battle that has been won. Competition authorities are looking deeply into that. What about sustainability? This is where I will surprise some. And since I will surprise some, I want to be very clear and very careful. So I firmly believe that climate change is the biggest challenge for humanity right now. So it's the biggest problem that we face. So I have no doubt about it. It has to be tackled, it has to be addressed, and there are different tools which have to be through a system of taxes and subsidies. We want people to adopt clean technologies, tax the dirty ones, and so forth. But what about competition? And this is where instead it will be the more surprising aspect that I have. Here I think my economics is saying that this has very little to do with competition. What do I mean? We want people to adopt clean solutions. Clean solutions have what we call positive externalities. Sorry if I'm going to be pedantic here, but positive externalities means that people don't internalize them, don't think about them, and they don't adopt enough. So you want people to adopt more of that stuff because it generates good stuff. It cleans the environment to the benefit of everybody. So there is not enough positive externalities. So what you want to do, you want to make things cheaper, right? For adoption, especially by families, by individuals. So instead, how relaxing competition policy, because that's the implication, can actually help to achieve that. Okay? Competition is great to get good, cheap prices. Maybe not cheap enough. That's why you need subsidies on top. But relaxing competition policy is orthogonal to this. It doesn't pass my test of being a competition problem. It doesn't. Of course, I know that the response to that is that firms really would like to do the greatest thing for humanity, but they cannot meet up because otherwise they are so scared that competition authority will accuse them of forming cartels. That's what they're saying. I think this is just greenwashing. Because in the current battle of ideas, there is a strong pro-enforcement movement, of which, of course, I am one of those advocating for it. The reaction is that some of the people which are against this pro-enforcement movement are desperate to find things against the pro-enforcement movement to counterbalance it. And sustainability is what they've come up with. In my experience, because again, I want to see, give me the evidence. When can you tell me of a case where something didn't happen before? Because in my experience, I found only one case when I was chief economist of the EU, where car manufacturers, in particular German car manufacturers, it's not true that the EU is only against American companies. We do a lot of stuff against European companies too, is that you don't hear about that because you are on the other side of the Atlantic. So we found out that these companies had to compete to reduce emissions, to have new catalytic stuff, etc. And instead, they found out it was very expensive. And instead of innovating each one against each other, they met. And they decided to innovate less and bring less innovation in that field. And so we found a big cartel. Okay? So under the current laws, yes, they were already meeting despite the laws, and they were meeting to do something which was not environmentally friendly. It was the opposite. So this is where I want to think just to reassess a little bit whether this is a priority or not. Moving for the last 5 minutes into the future, what do I hope? What I wish for the future, including Mexico. So you have heard, I don't hide myself. I really wish for more rigorous enforcement, more vigorous and rigorous. Enforcers must be independent. You should continue being an independent enforcer, have you been. You should, of course, follow, the zeitgeist, the political priorities, but you may also want to contribute to setting political priorities, because it's important. You can participate to that, so you can do that. You should do things that matter for people. Sometimes don't jump on the trendy stuff, algorithms and things. It's fun, yes, but sometimes you have to get a sense of a mission. So what I miss the most from my stint as an enforcer is that it was very clear what we had to do. And I really hope that the people working for Conferencia understand that what you're doing is great, it's important. And you have to understand that the mission you have is very clear. Enforcing competition policy is something which has all the benefits that we told at the very beginning of this talk. Do case studies. Construct memorable stories. It's not just about public relations, but you need to have the politicians on your side, because the politicians are those which are gonna help you with more resources, which you always need, of course, but you need to tell them stories. And we're not telling them the good stories enough. And the good stories don't need to be the future, humanity is doomed by algorithm, etc. Leave someone else to do that, okay? But think about the priorities for the Mexican economy. Maybe it has to do with farmers. Maybe it has to do with tuition fees in schools. Maybe it has to do with funeral fees. I don't know, but think about things that really matter for your citizens and understand that they can be improved by having good competition in those fields. And then if you tell those stories to the media, to the politicians, this is something that is going to be helpful. You should listen to your own local entrepreneurs. My experience is also that they were typically voices that were not heard. There is a community, the big law firms, the big companies, the big corporates who are prepared in the lobbying game, in the advocacy game. They always talk to you. They always have access to your ears, I'm sure they have. Because we go in the same places, there are revolving doors and all that. Instead, the small guys, they don't even know that there may be a legislative change or they're changing regulation. And this is the people you need to listen to, both to educate them and to understand their industries. So you really need to do whatever you can to facilitate business formation in Mexico. And this is something that competition can do. In a very pragmatic sense, I've already also said what I think the priority for you should be, or for any antitrust enforcer, is to focus on mergers. Mergers are incredibly important. Sure, abuse cases are more sexy, more fun, you have to have more articulated theories of art, but when it comes to how they matter for the economy, it's mergers that matter. Because mergers, when you get close to monopolization, is very difficult to undo that. To go back in time, it's almost impossible. Break up, good luck, okay? It's gonna take 20 years. You may think about it, but so this is something that you need to enforce more vigorously. And I think the direction that, for once, the FTC and the DOJ are taking now is a good one to follow. Participate with that debate and perhaps do something there too. There is a rebuttable part in mergers, so it's not that you want to block any merger which involves very large firms. You start from that presumption. And it's great. You save on resources. You don't waste into silly market definition analysis, which is leading you nowhere, okay? And you then rebut, you throw the ball into the other side's camp. They have to do the analysis to prove that efficiencies, if they exist, must be cogent, merger specific, and can be proven to you. So, good news for the economists, especially if you are consultants, don't fear that you have lost your job. What I'm saying is that the job of the consultant economist will probably change to go into the rebuttable part, which I think, of course, the asymmetry of resources will still be there, but at least it would be grounded on the meat of the case, on the real substance of the case, which is instead a step that we rarely reach in the current system because we spend endless resources which are limited into things which are not very relevant, and then we stop there. Thank you very much, and this is my wishful thinking for the future. Okay, I'll go randomly. What do you think about the latest book of Acemoglu Johnson called Power and Technology? They said that workers need market power to get the benefits from technology. So what do I think? Acemoglu is one of the contemporary geniuses in economics. Another prediction which I can make, which is easier, is that he will be awarded the Nobel Prize in the next 10 years. So that's a prediction I can make. Acemoglu is actually very concerned. Is very concerned of, he has produced even another paper called AI harm. So harm, so it already tells you what it stands for. And he's saying lots of things. One of the things is that he's devising all the negatives, and he says, but we don't have data. So one of the paradoxes in our economies is that these large corporations, the big tech, have collected a trove of data, which is unprecedented, which have never shared with anybody. So in principle, lots of answers are there, but nobody can look into it. So if you have powers as regulators to have access on the data of these companies, that's going to be super useful. He's also concerned that there is no, basically, it's a version of the superstars economics. So the big firms, they invest a lot, they become even bigger, no one else can match the investments, and therefore they become semi-monopolists without challengers. They stay at the top and they keep everything. And same thing, workers don't get those benefits. So in a sense, it's saying if workers can, it's like form unions, in a sense, they can become a countervailing power to that in order to get more benefits. The book is interesting and is very concerned. He's not a competition economist. He's one of the best economists of our generation generally, and is very concerned about the future of the data economy in a sense. Let me go to the next one. Under the current system, taxes and subsidies haven't been enough for sustainability. If competition is reducing costs, how can companies have sustainable incentives if that is a cost disadvantage? So first of all, if competition is about reducing cost, I'm not 100% sure I understand this, but if there is a system of costs and subsidies which is done uniformly in a certain industry, this doesn't put any at least firm in that market in a disadvantageous situation. Costs and subsidies are the right way to tackle externalities. So maybe I give you a different example, which is less controversial. Think about smoking. So smoking is the opposite of green technology. It generates negative externalities. So we don't want people to smoke. So, and we have two tools there. One is the classical one, which is we should tax cigarettes so that this reduces consumption. And the tax, by the way, may go into the budget of the health system, which is what you should be doing. The alternative is instead use competition policy in the wrong way, allow a merger to monopoly of the tobacco companies. So by becoming monopolists, they increase the price and people smoke less. And you're laughing, but this is just a mirror image of the problem I was describing as greenwashing before. It's a mirror image. You don't want to do that. You want to use the right tool, which is subsidy. So also here, once you have a system of subsidies or taxes, if a firm becomes more efficient at producing that technology, they should win in the market. So I don't see a contradiction. You said that authorities may bring back a structural rebuttable presumption. Yeah? That may apply to murders or unilateral conduct. However, what do you think about the structural presumption in market investigations such as those in the UK, for example? For example, in breaking up firms, there are two different things in the question. So structural presumption is currently being discussed about mergers. I've written about it, other people have written about it. Can it also be applied for behavioral stuff, for conduct? And if you want me to be honest, I think it should. So with a degree of caution. What do I mean by that? I mean that we should establish some bright lines when it comes to exclusivity involving very large firms. Some particular pricing patterns, bundling, okay? A few areas, not across the board. Re-establish a structural presumption also there. For very large firms, et cetera, there is no reason as you should do bundling now, except the rebuttable part, you prove it. The economics that we have done, and again, this is economic I've seen in cases, it's not the one that comes from textbook or from academic papers, which goes under, in this exclusivity case, goes under the term of the as efficient competitor test. It's been a mess. It's been a complete mess, okay? So to do this kind of economic, so case by case, it's per se, it's not by object, let's see, it has produced a set of incoherent results that are just making a judge when he's listening to the economist, his hair, if he still has hair, will go up in the sky. So I think we should be honest and also find a few, and this is where academic help is also needed. Select a few areas where bright lines can be reintroduced also when it comes to behavior. Breakups is something related, of course, to a structural presumption. And if you think about it, it's a natural consequence. If you think that the problem in a market is related to structure, size, concentration, no behavioral remedy can go, because you still keep the incentives there. And so the natural conclusion is that you should think about breaking up companies. So there, I know it's difficult. I said earlier, but we have done it. In the US, AT&T, the telecoms monopoly. In the UK, British Telecom, in railways, in energy. So we have done it. So what I'm saying is that don't exclude it. So people immediately say, so difficult to unscramble the eggs. It's impossible to unscramble the eggs. If you start your conversation like this, of course you go nowhere. Okay. So instead, you can be ambitious. When it comes to big tech, this is a case I would be surprised if Confessor was involved. There's more maybe the DOJ and the European Union. If anything, the kind of integration which has happened among big tech, Facebook, WhatsApp, Instagram, this kind of acquisition, or in the ad space, Google, DoubleClick, and all these things, these are integration of software. So it's not like breaking up. We are in a high-rise building, take away the basement. If you take away the basement, it collapses. Instead, this is about taking away lines of duplicating lines of code. So I'm not a computer scientist, but if anything, I see it less difficult than in other industries. Asimov, we did. The tension between, again, so you're very concerned about the antitrust efforts in the transition to green economy, risk of greenwashing and anti-competitive prices. So I think, and the resilience, okay, can you include the concept of economic resilience in an antitrust investigation? Yes, yeah, resilience in an antitrust investigation is indeed what you could be doing, because in the simplest form, is what I already alluded to, resilience means lack of alternative. So resilience is when you have alternatives. And instead, dependence, and we have a lack of alternatives. And lack of alternatives means a bottleneck. A bottleneck means monopolization. So you can easily cast a case which has to do with resilience of an economy in antitrust terms. And greenwashing, I think I've already commented before. Perhaps the question was written before I actually spoke about it, and there is a panel about it in the next session. So I think I'll thank you, and I'll stop here. Thank you so much. Yes.